Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 360 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the mysterious field of parapsychology. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Since the scientific revolution began, numerous branches of science have developed, and many of them are quite recent. One of these is parapsychology. It began in the 19th century, and research in the field continues to today. But very few people understand it. So what is parapsychology? What subjects does it cover, and what have parapsychologists found out? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, why did you want to do this mystery?
Well, I've been studying parapsychology for some time. In fact, I now teach parapsychology regularly at the Rhine Education Center. I've fallen into the role of being the Rhine's usual instructor for their Introduction to Parapsychology course. In fact, I'm scheduled to teach the intro course for them twice this year, once in their quarter that starts at the end of this month and once in their fall quarter. So if you're interested in what I have to say today, you'll have two chances to take the full course this year. They also have me teach other courses as well, such as about how different religions use the concepts that are studied by parapsychology. And it struck me that although we regularly deal with parapsychological topics here on Mysterious World, I've never actually done a show explaining what parapsychology is and what it covers. So I decided to rectify that. What I plan to do is give you a glimpse of one of the things that I do when I teach the subject. Back when I was in grad school teaching Introduction to Philosophy, one of the techniques I developed was formulating a kind of outline for the course. We would build the outline as we went, repeating the elements of the outline that we'd already covered, and added new elements to the outline as we covered new topics. As a result of that repetition, the students learned the key elements I was covering in Introduction to Philosophy really well. And so when I started teaching Introduction to Parapsychology, I decided to do something similar. I developed a set of 9 basic statements about parapsychology that summarize it. And every class I teach on parapsychology, whether it's the intro course or not, I repeat the 9 basics of parapsychology. That way, the students get the core elements of the field very firmly fixed in mind. So what I plan to do today is go over the 9 basics of parapsychology, and that will give the listeners a good basic grasp of the field.
Then how would you like to begin?
By starting with mapping the overall conceptual space that parapsychology exists within. This will help us understand both what it is and what it isn't. So we're going to start with the related concept of the paranormal. This term has really taken off in recent years, especially in the last 20 years, and people often speak of parapsychological events as paranormal ones, so this makes it a helpful starting point. Basically, the word paranormal is pretty easy to figure out. In Greek, para is a preposition that means alongside or beyond, and normal is a familiar English word. So the paranormal is something that exists alongside or beyond the normal.
So that introduces a new concept, which is what people consider normal. So who gets to decide what's normal?
Well, that's a key question because what is considered normal in one culture is very different from what's considered normal in others. For example, there are cultures all over the world where things like having prophetic dreams are considered totally normal. There are Native American cultures where Sasquatch or Bigfoot are considered totally normal. And even in our own culture, the idea of contact with the spirits of the departed used to be considered quite normal. If you go back a few centuries and read a London newspaper, you'll find perfectly straightforward accounts of ghosts haunting particular houses. But eventually, after the Enlightenment, a kind of skeptical materialism became common in modern Western society, and all of those things ceased to be considered normal. The term paranormal was then coined in 1905, and it was coined here in the West, so it was the West's understanding of normal that's involved. And thus, what is paranormal is whatever modern Western culture considers apart from or beyond the normal.
That covers an awful lot of territory. There are lots of experiences that people report that aren't considered to be normal ones in our culture, at least from the viewpoint of skeptical materialism.
True. For example, people report extraterrestrial activity like alien and UFO encounters, and those are not considered normal, so they go in the paranormal category. Then there are reports of encounters with hidden animals or cryptids like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. Those aren't considered normal, so they're paranormal too. There are also religious experiences like divine miracles, angelic encounters, and demonic possession, so those are also normal. Then there are reports of psychic phenomena like extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. And there are reports of phenomena connected with the survival of bodily death, like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, spirit communication, reincarnation reports, and reports of ghosts. And skeptical materialism doesn't consider any of these to be normal, so they all go in the paranormal bucket.
But parapsychology doesn't deal with all of those, does it?
No, it leaves many of these fields to other areas of study. For example, parapsychology normally does not look at reports of extraterrestrial experiences. It leaves those to the field of ufology to consider. Similarly, it doesn't normally look at hidden animals like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. It leaves those to the field of cryptozoology. And it normally doesn't look at religious experiences like miracles, angels, or demonic possession. It leaves those to individual religions that involve the concepts or to academic fields like religious studies.
And that still leaves us with psychic experiences and survival-related phenomena.
And those are the two areas that parapsychology is concerned with because they both deal with human consciousness. As we mentioned, in Greek, para means alongside or beyond, psyche means mind or soul, and logeia means a speech or a field of study. So psychology means the academic study of the human mind or human consciousness, and parapsychology is a field that exists alongside this study. If psychic functioning exists, then it's believed to be an aspect of the human mind or human consciousness, and the survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death is also obviously related to human consciousness. So this gives us the first basic of parapsychology. Parapsychology is a branch of science that studies psychic phenomena and the survival of bodily death.
Okay, before we go on, let's consider an objection that skeptics may make. You've just said that parapsychology is a branch of science that studies psychic phenomena and the survival of bodily death. But why should we consider it a branch of science at all?
Here, I'd like to introduce a new term into our discussion, and it's a term that not many English speakers will be familiar with. It's the German term Wissenschaft. It doesn't have an exact English equivalent, but if you were to bring it into English based on its etymology or its word parts, it would mean knowledge ship or knowledge making. It refers to the academic study of a particular area, and that can be any area at all. So Wissenschaft includes both what we would call the sciences and the humanities. Thus, things like history and the arts are considered Wissenschaft, just like physics and chemistry and biology. But in English, we don't have an equivalent for Wissenschaft, a term that embraces all areas of academic study. Instead, we have the sciences and the humanities, and the term science is connected with what's known as the scientific method. Now, it would be hypothetically possible for a person to study psychic experiences and survival experiences in an academic way that's consistent with the methodology used in the humanities, like historians who study history. One could simply study the history of reports of psychic experiences or the history of reported ghost encounters. And if that was all parapsychologists did, then parapsychology would be a form of Wissenschaft that would qualify as one of the humanities. But that's not all that parapsychologists do. They do study the history of things, but they also use the scientific method.
And that's a concept that listeners may have heard of, but may not be particularly familiar with or remember from grade school when most of us learned it. So what's the scientific method?
It's a set of tools that were developed to help drive the scientific revolution that began after the Middle Ages. It can be articulated in different ways, but basically it involves a series of steps that one uses when doing research. One begins with an observation that you want to explain or a question that you want to answer. Then you do research pertaining to that topic. You then propose a hypothesis or an explanation to explain the data that you have. Then you test that hypothesis by performing an experiment. You analyze the data that you get from the experiment and what it says about your hypothesis. Then you report your conclusions to the scientific community so that other people can benefit from what you've learned. And that leads to further research cycles where people try to learn more. One of the things that distinguishes the scientific method from other forms of research is that explanations or hypotheses are tested by experiment. In other words, you don't just propose ideas that could explain observations, you run tests to see whether your explanations hold up or not. In fact, in the opinion of many, a claim is not considered scientific unless there is some kind of test that you could run that could potentially show that the claim is false. That's one of the reasons why the idea of the multiverse is not considered scientific by many, including me, because at present we have no way of running a test to see if the multiverse is real or not. As a result, it's currently a metaphysical speculation rather than a scientific claim that is testable. Well, here's the thing. Parapsychologists do use the scientific method. They don't just propose explanations for observations. They do tests, including laboratory tests, to see whether their predictions hold up. And because they know that they're going to get pushback from skeptics, parapsychologists can actually use better methods than other scientists. I mean, for example, you may know that in medical tests, they use double-blind trials where neither the person being given a drug nor the person administering the drug know whether the drug is real or whether it's a placebo. Such double-blind trials are considered the gold standard in medical research. But parapsychologists can go way beyond double-blind trials. As we'll discuss in a future episode, there have been mediumship studies that were quintuple blinded, where nobody involved in the research has the complete picture of what's going on until after the data collection is over. And so parapsychologists can hold themselves to much higher standards than other scientists. Consequently, parapsychology has achieved significant recognition as a science. For example, the Parapsychological Association, or PA, which is the major professional association for parapsychologists, has been affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science since 1969. And in case you're not familiar with them, they are the world's largest general scientific society and the publishers of the journal Science, which, together with its rival Nature, is one of the top peer-reviewed science journals in the world. So no matter what you hear from skeptics, parapsychology is an actual branch of science.
That doesn't mean that people don't have a lot of mistaken ideas about parapsychology, though. What are some of the things that people confuse parapsychology with?
Well, there's a whole list of things. For a start, parapsychology is not the same thing as spirituality. Like when people, say they're not religious but spiritual. Spirituality is a concept that doesn't really have a clear definition, but parapsychology does. It's the scientific study of psychic phenomena and the survival of bodily death. Conversely, parapsychology is not the same thing as religion, and that means that parapsychology is not the same as any particular religion. For example, it is not the same thing as the religion known as spiritualism, which is a religious belief system that started in the 1800s and involves contact with the spirits of the departed. Parapsychology is also not the same thing as the New Age movement, which is a religious movement that combines ideas from Asian religions like Hinduism and Buddhism with Western religions like Christianity. Parapsychology also is not the same thing as the occult. The concept of the occult also lacks a stable definition, and I don't find it to be a useful concept. It's often used just to run something down without saying specifically what's wrong with the thing. But whatever you understand the concept of the occult to mean, it isn't parapsychology, which is a branch of science. Consequently, given its narrow scope, there are a whole bunch of things that parapsychology does not study. For instance, as we've indicated, it does not study things like UFOs or aliens or ancient astronauts or cryptids like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, or reports of weird humans like vampires, werewolves, and zombies. It also does not study reported locations like the Bermuda Triangle or lost continents like Atlantis. It does not study fortune-telling methods like astrology, tarot, or the I Ching. It does not study witchcraft, and it does not study angels and demons. None of those are what parapsychology is about. It's the scientific study of psychic functioning and the survival of bodily death. And that's it, at least normally.
Okay, what do you mean, at least normally?
Well, parapsychology studies none of the things I just mentioned unless, in a particular case, they involve the two things parapsychology does study, psychic functioning or the survival of bodily death. For example, let's consider the case of a man who lived in the 20th century named Ted Owens. He was what is known as a contactee, that is, a person who is in contact with extraterrestrials. This is not the same thing as an abductee, which is where someone reports being kidnapped by aliens. Contactees don't report being kidnapped, but they do report being in communication with aliens. They were a big deal back in the 1950s and 60s, and we will have future episodes on UFO contactees. Well, Owens was a contactee, and he thought that it was possible for other people to become contactees too. Thus, he wrote a book called How to Contact Space People. Now, as a contactee, Ted Owens would be someone that parapsychologists would normally have no interest in studying. But Owens also claimed to have psychic abilities. Specifically, he claimed to have very strong psychokinesis, or mind over matter abilities. In fact, Owens even called himself the PK man, PK being an abbreviation for psychokinesis. And psychokinesis is something that parapsychologists are interested in. So when Owens contacted some parapsychologists, there was some interest in studying him, finding out, does he really have PK abilities or not? And a parapsychologist named Jeffrey Mishlove ended up writing a book about him called The PK Man. So parapsychologists were interested in Owens, but not because he was a UFO contactee. Whether he was really in contact with aliens or not, well, that would be something for ufologists to look at. What parapsychologists would be interested in was whether Owens could display psychic functioning. So there can be crossover between parapsychology and other disciplines when a particular situation involves the two areas that parapsychology does study. And it's on that basis that the Rhine has asked me to teach courses on religion and parapsychology, because there is considerable overlap between what religion covers and what parapsychology covers. In the first place, religion reports effects that could conceivably be produced by psychic functioning, like knowing the future, which you could either interpret as prophecy or as precognition. And one of the major things that religions deal with is the survival of bodily death, which is straight up parapsychology's alley. So as an expert in religion who also studies parapsychology, I kind of live at the intersection of the two domains. And I've been told that of all the people currently working in parapsychology at the moment, I'm likely one of the most knowledgeable, or even the most knowledgeable people on religion and how it intersects with parapsychology. And that I need to start publishing in academic journals as a result, which I plan to do.
That's not to say that there aren't others in parapsychology who have a religious viewpoint.
Oh, no. In fact, there are lots of religious people in parapsychology, and there always have been. There have even been religious specialists. These include people like Joseph Glanville, who was a British clergyman in the 1600s and one of the pioneers of what later became parapsychology. In the 20th century, there was Walter Franklin Prince, who was an Episcopalian priest and an early parapsychologist. On the Catholic side of things, there was Father Herbert Thurston, who was a British Jesuit and a parapsychologist, and also Father Alois Weisinger, who was from Austria and was a Cistercian abbot and a parapsychologist. The four men I've just named happen to be ministers in their respective traditions, and that's not to mention all the lay people from different religions. So just like scientists in other fields can have a variety of religious viewpoints, whether they're physicists or chemists or biologists or whatever, the same thing is true in parapsychology. And they can even be clergymen, like Father Georges Lemaitre, who proposed the Big Bang in cosmology that's now standard.
This gets us to another topic, which I'm sure you go into more in your religion and parapsychology courses. But there's a difference between how a religious person would look at an event and how a parapsychologist might, like the example you gave with having knowledge of the future. From a religious perspective, that could be prophecy, a divine revelation from God, while from a parapsychological perspective, that could be the natural psychic ability known as precognition.
This is what's known as the source of psi problem, and it's going to lead to our second basic of parapsychology. Actually, the next several basics will cover all deal with psychic functioning, and then the final basics we'll look at deal with the survival of bodily death. The 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet is psi, to pronounce it the Greek way. It's spelled psi, and it's also the first letter of the word psyche, which is the word for mind or soul, from which we get both the words psychology and the word parapsychology. Well, in the 20th century, people started using the Greek letter psi as a kind of shorthand to refer to psychic functioning. So telepathy is a form of psi, precognition is a form of psi, psychokinesis is a form of psi, and so on. The question is, when one of these things is happening, what's causing it? That's the source of psi problem. What's the source that makes it happen? From a religious perspective, if someone mysteriously starts knowing things about the future, there are a bunch of possibilities. It might be a divine revelation from God. It might be something an angel told them, or something a saint told them, or something a ghost told them, or something a demon told them. Or if psychic functioning is real, it might be a natural human ability. And with other religions, there are other options too, like the idea it might be produced by one of the gods, or by a jinn, or by a nature spirit. And if you're Ted Owens, it might be aliens. So there are a bunch of possibilities. But being scientists, parapsychologists take a tip from William of Ockham. He was the 14th century Franciscan friar who gave us the principle known as Occam's razor, which can be summarized as do not multiply entities beyond necessity. In other words, don't propose more things than you need to explain the data you have. For example, if you have an electronic device like an iPhone and you have evidence that it works because it has little particles flowing in it known as electrons, you could go further and say that the reason that the electrons flow is that they're being pushed by tiny invisible gnomes. But here's the thing. We have evidence that electrons exist, but we don't have evidence for the tiny invisible gnomes. So our friend William of Ockham would say, well, don't multiply entities beyond what you need to explain the data. So we should prefer theories involving the electrons, but not theories involving the invisible gnomes, at least given our present state of evidence. Well, parapsychologists use the same principle in looking at situations involving psychic functioning, or psi. If someone has a psychic dream about what's going to happen tomorrow, and it doesn't have a religious significance, it's just a random thing, you weren't praying to God beforehand to get this dream, you didn't hear the voice of God or an angel or any other creature, so you don't have evidence that any person other than you was involved, just the person who had the dream. Well, William of Ockham would say that if you don't have evidence of anybody else being involved, then don't assume anyone else is involved. Assume that this psychic thing that happened was caused by the person involved until you get evidence that someone else was also involved. Parapsychologists thus generally assume that psychic functioning is a natural human ability, a product of the human mind. And that's the second basic of parapsychology. Psychic abilities are generally treated as natural human abilities, that is, abilities of the human mind.
Let me interject here with a question from the faith perspective. What's a Christian supposed to make of that claim? Can psychic abilities really be natural human abilities?
Well, there's nothing in the faith that says they can't be. In fact, there have been a variety of Christian thinkers, including doctors of the church, who have held exactly this view. I go into this in much more detail when I teach courses on religion and parapsychology, but for now I'll mention just two examples, one ancient and one modern. First, there was St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 1200s and who was a doctor of the church, meaning he's one of the world's top 40 theologians of all time. And he was one of several doctors of the church who believed in what today would be called psychic abilities. That is, abilities that God built into human nature. For example, Aquinas believed in natural human precognition, which he called natural prophecy, to distinguish it from the supernatural prophecy that God gives. Aquinas also believed in a form of psychokinesis, or mind over matter, which was his explanation for the evil eye. And second, for our modern example, there is Father Alois Weisinger, who proposed that psychic abilities are the remnants of preternatural gifts that Adam and Eve had before the fall and that are still functional in us today. He discussed this in his book, Occult Phenomena in the Light of Theology, for example. So there is nothing in principle contrary to the faith in parapsychology's second basic.
Then let's turn to the third. What does it involve?
At this point, we start looking more closely at psychic functioning, and it comes in two types. The third basic is that psychic abilities are divided into extrasensory perception, or ESP, and psychokinesis, or PK. In Latin, extra means outside or beyond. So you have extrasensory perception if you're perceiving something without using the physical senses. That's what makes it extrasensory, or outside the senses. Sometimes people get a little confused here and think that ESP involves a bonus or additional sense, like when you hear people talking about a sixth sense, but it really means outside the senses altogether. So extrasensory perception, or ESP, involves gaining information about things without using the standard senses. That makes ESP a receptive form of psi, since it involves receiving information about the world. The flip side of that would be an active form of psi that affects the world, and that's what psychokinesis is. In Greek, psyche means mind, and kinein means to move. So psychokinesis is movement that is caused by the mind. And just like extrasensory perception gets abbreviated as ESP, psychokinesis gets abbreviated as PK. Outside of parapsychology, like in science fiction, for example, you'll often hear PK referred to as telekinesis. In Greek, tele means distant, like in television and telephone, distant vision and distant voice. But parapsychologists pointed out that mind over matter doesn't have to involve anything that's distant. I mean, you might be having an influence over something that's right in front of you or even in your hand. So the word telekinesis presupposes something that may not be the case. It may not involve any actual distance. And so today the term psychokinesis is preferred in parapsychology. So you have the two basic forms of psychic functioning, or psi. ESP is receptive and gets you information about the world, while PK is expressive and influences things in the world. And that puts us in position to derive our fourth basic of parapsychology. If parapsychology studies psychic functioning and the survival of bodily death, and if psychic functioning is divided into ESP and PK, then we can say that parapsychology studies three things. So our next basic is, therefore, the principal areas of study in parapsychology are ESP, PK, and survival.
So, if those are the three buckets that everything goes into in parapsychology, let's look more carefully at each one of them. Let's start with ESP. What forms of extrasensory perception are there?
Well, there are a number of different types, and they've gone by different names in history. I'll have a little more to say about that after I explain what they are. But today, ESP is generally broken into three types, which are telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. In Greek, tele means distant, and pathos means feeling. So based on its etymology or word parts, you'd think that telepathy means feeling at a distance. And that is what the word originally meant when it was coined. It originally referred to the distant sharing of feelings with someone, or what today would be called psychic empathy. But the word telepathy changed meanings. In the 19th century, they referred to what we would call telepathy as thought transference. That is, the distant sharing of thoughts rather than just feelings. And so today, telepathy refers to the distant sharing of thoughts, not just feelings. You thus can think of telepathy as a way of picking up information at a distance without using the senses and getting that information from another mind. So it's a form of mind-to-mind contact. And the minds involved aren't necessarily all human. In episode 298 at mysterious.fm/298, we discussed the possibility of pet telepathy, and we heard and saw video of pets like dogs who could tell when their owners were about to come home, even though they had no way of knowing this using their physical senses. We also saw a video of an African gray parrot named Nkisi who could verbalize what was in photographs that her owner was looking at, even though Nkisi's owner was in another room. So this looked like the dogs and Nkisi were getting this information through telepathic contact with their owners.
If telepathy is mind-to-mind contact, what about clairvoyance?
Well, the term clairvoyance has also changed meaning. In the 1800s, any psychic ability could be called clairvoyance. And so a person that today would be called a psychic would have been called a clairvoyant back then. But now the term is more restricted, and its meaning is based on its roots. In French, clair means clear, and voyance means seeing. So based on its word parts, clairvoyance means clear seeing, but it refers to the ability to pick up information at a distance without getting that information from another mind. In other words, you're getting information from a distant or hidden place. You can thus think of clairvoyance as a kind of mind-to-place contact. More recently, the term remote viewing has been used for clairvoyance in some circles, such as in the Defense Department's Stargate program, which we talked about in episodes 156 and 157, where I interviewed former Defense Department psychic spy Paul Smith, and again in episodes 190 and 191, where I interviewed his colleague Bill Ray. But fundamentally, remote viewing is just another name for clairvoyance. I also should mention that there's another set of variant terms related to clairvoyance. Some psychics break down clairvoyance based on which of the senses it involves. So if they get visual information at a distance, they call it clairvoyance. If they get auditory information, they call it clairaudience. If they just get raw information without any sense being engaged, they just somehow know it, they call it claircognizance, and they refer to all of these variations together as the clairs. So you will encounter that terminology. However, parapsychologists don't tend to worry about what sense the information presents itself through. And so in parapsychology, they just refer to clairvoyance and leave it at that.
Then what about precognition? What does that involve?
In Latin, the preposition pre means before, and cognitio means knowledge. So precognition means knowing beforehand or foreknowledge. It refers to getting information without using the senses from a future time. There's also the reverse of precognition, which is known as retrocognition. In Latin, retro means backwards. So retrocognition is like precognition in reverse. It means getting information from a time that's in the past. You could think of precognition and retrocognition as two different abilities, but parapsychologists tend not to. They tend to think of them both as a single ability that's just pointed in different directions, either the past or the future. And they tend to speak of it only in terms of precognition. So you can think of both precognition and retrocognition as ways of getting information through time or mind-to-time contact.
Okay, so telepathy is mind-to-mind contact, clairvoyance is mind-to-place contact, and precognition is mind-to-time contact. That pretty much covers where your mind might get information from, either from another mind, another place, or another time. And so these are the terms that are used for these abilities, but you said that you'd have more to say about how these terms have been used in the past. What did you want to mention?
Well, there are a few things. The first one is that in previous centuries, these abilities often weren't split up the way I just divided them. For example, in the Bible and in most of church history, they were all lumped together under the term prophecy. Thus, if you look in Luke 22, verses 63 to 65, you have some soldiers who are mocking Jesus, and they blindfold him. They then hit him, they strike him, and they say, "Prophecy, who is the one that struck you?" Now, the fact that he's blindfolded means that he can't see who struck him using his senses. But even though they say prophecy, they're not asking for information about the future. They're asking him to reveal something that's hidden from his eyes because of the blindfold. So today, we would call that clairvoyance, but they've lumped it into the category prophecy. And that's the term that was used for any form of extrasensory perception in most of Christian history. They just call it prophecy. So when St. Thomas Aquinas refers to natural prophecy in contrast to God's supernatural prophecy, he's really thinking of any form of ESP. He's not separating them out the way we do today. And the same was true in later Christian usage. For example, in the 1700s, Pope Benedict XIV wrote that prophecy is the foreknowledge of future events, that would be precognition, but it sometimes extends to past events, that would be retrocognition, of which there is no recollection nor any certain indications. And it extends to present events distant in place and hidden, that would be clairvoyance, and to the inward thoughts of the heart, that would be telepathy. And so he is a prophet who divinely knows those things which are removed from the senses, that would be all of extrasensory perception, and the natural knowledge of men, and is able to make them known. So as we can see in Christian usage, prophecy covers all the kinds of information that ESP does. The question being whether in a particular case it's natural prophecy that's due to a natural human ability or supernatural prophecy that's due to divine revelation.
I understand that this lumping of all the forms of ESP into the single term prophecy is similar to something in parapsychology. What is that?
Well, in parapsychology, it's sometimes difficult to tell which form of ESP a person may be using. To illustrate this, let's suppose that you and I are doing a test with ESP cards, which are also called Zener cards because they were invented by a man named Carl Zener. These are the cards that you see Bill Murray using in the 1984 movie Ghostbusters, and they have 5 simple shapes on them: circle, cross, wavy lines, square, and star. They don't really use Zener cards in serious ESP tests anymore, but they did at one time. So let's suppose that you and I are doing a telepathy test, and I hold up a card with its back to you, and I say, "What card am I looking at?" You say, "Square," and I say, "You're right," and I turn the card around and show you it was in fact a square. Now, since we were doing a telepathy test, I asked you to pull that information from my mind, from mind-to-mind contact. But how do I know that's the way you got the information? I mean, for example, how do I know that instead of using telepathy to get the information from my mind, you didn't use clairvoyance instead? I mean, maybe when I'm holding the card with the back to you, you used clairvoyance to peek at the hidden side of the card and see that it was a square. Or maybe you used precognition instead. Maybe you peeked into the future to the moment where I turned the card around and showed you the square. And maybe you did all of this subconsciously so that you just knew to say square and you couldn't really tell whether you were getting the information from my mind or from the backside of the card or from the future. You couldn't tell whether you were using telepathy, clairvoyance, or precognition. All of these are possibilities, and it can be hard to pull them apart and figure out which form of ESP a person was using in a test. When that happens, parapsychologists leave them all lumped together, and they refer to this as general extrasensory perception or general ESP or GESP, which is basically like the classical Christian concept of natural prophecy.
Isn't there any way to tell which form of ESP a person is using? Can't you force them to use one form rather than another?
There is a way to do that with precognition. And the way you do it is you construct the test so that the target isn't selected until after the person has made their guess. For example, if I said, "Guess what card I'm going to draw 5 minutes from now," and then you make your guess, and then I shuffle the cards several times so that they're fully randomized, and then I wait till the 5 minutes are up, and then I draw a card. In this case, you couldn't have looked into my mind when you made your guess because I didn't know what card I'd be drawing in 5 minutes. So my mind didn't contain that information. Similarly, you couldn't use clairvoyance to peek at the card because the cards hadn't even been randomized yet. So there was no hidden location where you could go to get that information. In this case, the only way for you to get the information would be to peek into the future. So it is possible to construct a test to force a participant to use precognition, but there's no easy way to force them to use telepathy or clairvoyance. However, all of this is more detailed information about ESP. The basic that you need to remember is the principal forms of extrasensory perception are telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition.
If that's what we need to know about ESP, then what about PK? You've already defined psychokinesis as mind over matter. What else do we need to know about it?
We often think of psychokinesis as affecting non-living matter. Like if I were able to levitate a book psychokinetically, the book's not alive. But depending on how you define psychokinesis, it doesn't have to apply just to non-living matter. Under some ways of conceptualizing it, it can apply to living matter itself. For example, suppose you want to heal someone without using a conventional means of healing. Well, if you're able to do that, if you're able to heal them psychically, well, then their body is made out of matter, and so that could be understood, that healing could be understood as mind over matter or psychokinesis. So that's the sixth basic of parapsychology to remember, that psychokinesis may involve both living and non-living things. This is also like St. Thomas Aquinas' explanation for the evil eye. Like many people in his day, he believed that if someone looked at you with venomous hatred, it could actually hurt you, especially if your physical form was frail, such as due to old age or if you were a child. So that would be one person's mind having an effect on another person's body. In fact, you could even argue that your control over your own body is a form of psychokinesis. For example, if I raise my hand in the air, we know part of the causal chain that explains this. It's because the muscles in my arm contract in such a way as to raise my hand, and the muscles contract because the nerves in my peripheral nervous system tell them to do so, and those nerves are connected to my brain, which is part of my central nervous system and is made out of nerves called neurons. But what we don't know is how my consciousness affects the nerves or neurons in my brain. Yet consciousness does have an effect on my brain. So you can understand that as mind over matter or psychokinesis. My mind tells my neurons what to do. They tell my peripheral nervous system what to do. That tells the muscles in my arm to contract in a certain way, and up my hand goes. So you can conceive of even your own bodily motions as a form of psychokinesis.
You said in the sixth basic that psychokinesis may affect both living and non-living matter, depending on how you conceptualize it. How else might you understand it?
Well, not everyone would want to put your own bodily motions into the same category as levitating a book. And similarly, not everyone would explain psychic healing in terms of psychokinesis. For example, you might say that what a healer actually does is get in touch with your subconscious and then kind of gives you a telepathic pep talk that triggers your own body's healing ability. So it's really you doing the healing rather than an external healer. In that case, the psychic healing would be due to telepathy rather than psychokinesis. So there are other ways of understanding this.
Is there anything else we ought to know about psychokinesis?
One of the things has to do with the scale on which it operates. Parapsychologists often differentiate between two different levels of psychokinesis depending on the size of the object that's affected. For example, if I levitate a book, well, you can see the book with the naked eye. It's a macroscopic object, and so this is called macropsychokinesis or macro PK. However, a lot of PK tests that are done these days don't involve macroscopic objects. For example, a parapsychologist might sit you down in front of a computer that's hooked up to a true random number generator, one that's based on something like radioactive decay or electron tunneling, neither of which can be predicted. So that's how it generates random numbers. And then the experimenter might ask you to influence the machine so that it comes up with way more ones than zeros or way more zeros than ones, whereas it would normally come up with an equal number of both. Well, you can't see the subatomic particles involved in radioactive decay or electron tunneling. They are microscopic objects. And so this is called micro psychokinesis or micro PK. So macro PK affects objects that you can see with the naked eye, while micro PK affects objects that are too small to see with the naked eye.
Aren't these terms of convenience, though? I mean, macroscopic and microscopic objects exist on a spectrum. There's not a firm line between them, and some objects are kind of in the middle.
This is true, and both macro PK and micro PK are terms of convenience, and there are cases that are somewhere in the middle. One example is spoon bending. We discussed this back in episode 227, so you can go to mysterious.fm/227 to hear about that. Now, a spoon is a macroscopic object. You can see spoons with your naked eye. But it's proposed, if you listen to that episode, that what's happening in spoon bending is that a person's PK is actually affecting the grains of metal that the spoon is composed of. And the grains of metal are too small to see with the naked eye. You have to use a microscope. So this is a kind of border case between macro and micro PK. Consequently, the seventh basic of parapsychology is that psychokinesis can manifest on the large scale, which is macro PK, on the small scale, which is micro PK, or in between.
So we're making good progress. We've covered 7 of your 9 basics of parapsychology, and we've discussed the basics that cover psychic functioning, or the first major area that parapsychology studies. And so next we'll turn to the second major area, or the survival of bodily death, after we take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Ron B., Damian M., Gene L., Dion M., and Martin G. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, the second major area that parapsychology studies is the survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death. How does it go about doing that?
Basically, by looking at evidence that could suggest that our minds or consciousness either might not or do not die when our bodies do. And there are basically 5 categories of evidence that parapsychologists look at. There are out-of-body experiences, or OBEs. There are death-related experiences. There's spirit communication, cases of the reincarnation type or court, and spontaneous field experiences that seem to involve survival. So we'll go through each of these.
Then let's start with out-of-body experiences, or OBEs. Aren't these often called cases of astral projection?
Yes, but not in parapsychology, not these days. The term astral projection comes from the new religious movement known as Theosophy, which was created by the Russian psychic Helena Blavatsky. And we'll be talking about Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky in a future episode. But parapsychologists no longer use the term astral projection for a couple of reasons. First, it's got the word astral in there, and astral means having to do with the stars. But so-called astral projection doesn't seem to have anything to do with the stars. Second, astral projection is what's known as a theory-laden term. That is, it presupposes a particular theory of what's happening in out-of-body experiences. Specifically, it presupposes that you're projecting something. And in Theosophy, the thing that you're supposed to be projecting is known as your astral body, which is not the same thing as your soul in Theosophy. The belief that humans have astral bodies is a religious belief among Theosophists, but parapsychologists don't have good evidence that we have them. And scientists generally want to avoid prejudicing the issues that they study, so they can want to avoid using theory-laden terms whenever they can. As a result, parapsychologists have retired the term astral projection, and instead they use the theory-neutral term out-of-body experience, because it seems in these experiences that your viewpoint shifts to outside of your body.
Are out-of-body experiences something reported only by theosophists?
Oh, absolutely not. Their term was popular for them for a while, but OBEs are reported in cultures all over the world. For example, we heard about some of Nicholas Black Elk's out-of-body experiences back in episodes 266 and 267. And St. Paul reports what may be an out-of-body experience in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2-4. He reports that 14 years earlier, he was caught up to the third heaven, and he says he doesn't know if he was in his body at the time or not. So if he wasn't in his body, this would be an out-of-body experience. And these reports from other cultures and other religions are another good reason not to use a term that comes specifically from theosophy and to prefer a neutral term instead.
But what do these experiences have to do with the survival of bodily death? Neither Nicholas Black Elk or St. Paul were dead when they had their experiences.
No, but depending on how you understand them, out-of-body experiences could be a form of evidence for survival. The question is whether anything leaves your body during an OBE. If something does leave your body, then that could suggest that at least that thing is not dependent on your body. And so when your body dies, that part of you might survive.
And what's the alternative to the idea of something leaving your body in an OBE?
That such experiences are actually just clairvoyance. In other words, that you clairvoyantly move your point of view from one place to another. You might start by looking down at your own body, but then you might shift your viewpoint somewhere else and end up at the Eiffel Tower or something. In this case, nothing would be leaving your body. Instead, you'd be experiencing what's known as traveling clairvoyance, and that wouldn't provide any special evidence that something survives death, except for the fact that psychic powers themselves may suggest that our minds aren't purely material.
What do people who have out-of-body experiences think of this question? Do they have an opinion on whether something leaves the body in OBEs or not?
They're not all agreed. There's a difference of opinion. For example, the out-of-body experiencer Alex Tanis was of the opinion that something does leave the body. He said it wasn't his soul, because if his soul left his body, he'd be dead. But he thought something left his body, and he called it Alex 2 to distinguish it from his regular body, which he called Alex 1. As Alex 1, he'd be lying in a bed for an experiment, and then he'd send Alex 2 down the hall to look at whatever hidden things the experimenters wanted him to look at. On the other hand, there is a contemporary out-of-body experiencer named Graham Nichols, who I know, who is of the opposite opinion. He reports that nothing leaves his body when he has an OBE. It's all just traveling clairvoyance. So this is currently an open question.
Then let's talk about the next category of experiences that could suggest the survival of bodily death. You referred to these as death-related experiences. What did you have in mind?
What I'm calling death-related experiences are things that happen in proximity to physical death, and that can be before, during, or after physical death. Among the more striking experiences that occur before death are what are known as deathbed visions, or DBVs. We covered these back in episode 318 at mysterious.fm/318. Basically, people report that when they're getting near death, people who are on their deathbeds, they frequently report a common set of phenomena. And these include things like seeing light and hearing music. They also include seeing figures like angels or deceased loved ones coming to greet them and help them cross over into the afterlife. And sometimes they get veridical information during their vision. That is, they learn things that turn out to be true, even though they had no natural way of knowing them. Particularly striking are what are known as peak in Darien experiences. That's P-E-A-K, a reference to a mountain peak in Darien Province, Panama. In an old poem, some explorers got up to the top of such a peak, and other explorers could see them from behind, as the first explorers were reacting to the sight of the Pacific Ocean that they were experiencing once they got up to the top of the peak in Darien. This literary illusion gave its name to situations in which someone was dying or had died, and they saw people in the afterlife that they didn't know were dead. And it turned out to be true that these individuals were dead. The person just hadn't known it before. In episode 318, we discussed peak in Darien experiences where a dying British woman learned that her brother, who was in India, had died, even though everyone thought he was alive. And we heard about another case where a different British woman learned that her sister had died, even though everyone in the hospital had been hiding this fact from her.
If those are examples of deathbed visions where a person is not yet dead, what about death-related experiences where a person seemingly has died?
These are what are known as near-death experiences, or NDEs. We discussed them way back in episode 27 at mysterious.fm/27, but I know so much more about NDEs now than I did then, so we're going to be revisiting this topic in a future episode and catch up on more about what research has suggested on NDEs. Also, we discussed disturbing near-death experiences, or DNDEs, in episode 292 at mysterious.fm/292. Regular NDEs were popularized by Raymond Moody in his 1975 book, Life After Life, and they've been heavily researched since then. That research has also uncovered the existence of disturbing NDEs, some of which are actually hellish. In any event, near-death experiencers often report experiences while they are clinically dead and have their hearts stopped, so their brains should not be working. These include things like having an out-of-body experience and looking down and seeing doctors and nurses working on them, traveling through a tunnel or dark place towards a bright light, seeing a beautiful realm, and meeting God or angels or deceased relatives, just like in deathbed visions.
If those are experiences that can occur during clinical death, what about ones that happen after death?
Here, we're no longer talking about near-death experiences because you get to come back from those, which is why they're called near-death experiences. If you actually experience final death, you don't come back. And so we're talking about a different set of experiences. Specifically, we're talking about what are known as after-death communications, or ADCs. We discussed these back in episodes 306 and 307 at mysterious.fm/306 and mysterious.fm/307. In these cases, living people report spontaneously receiving some form of communication from someone they know who has died, often very shortly after they died. These experiences can involve any or all of the senses. You might see your loved one. You might hear your loved one's voice. You might feel your loved one touching you, like giving you a hug. You might smell your loved one's perfume or pipe tobacco. You might have all of these things happen together, or you might just somehow know that your loved one is present. In these experiences, your loved one might give you a message like, "I'm fine, I'm happy, don't grieve for me," or "Please forgive me and please pray for me." Such experiences are extraordinarily common, with approximately 40% of the population reporting at least one ADC at some point in their lives. Needless to say, all of these death-related phenomena, deathbed visions, near-death experiences, and after-death communications, have a direct bearing on the survival of consciousness after bodily death, especially if they contain veridical information that a person did not previously know and that turns out to be true.
You just referred to after-death communications, or ADCs. How do you distinguish that from the next category in your list, spirit communication?
The basic difference is that ADCs are spontaneous and they don't require the involvement of a specialist. With after-death communication, you can just be at home when your departed loved one suddenly shows up and nobody but you and your departed loved one are there. By contrast, spirit communication is planned in advance. It is not spontaneous, and it typically involves a specialist like a medium or a mystic.
And what's the difference between a medium and a mystic?
A medium is someone you go to specifically in order to make contact with the dead for you. They are an intermediary between you and the dead. They're job is to establish communication between the dead and pass that information between you and them. That's why they're called mediums. By contrast, mystics don't view their job as establishing communication between the living and the dead. God may let them have contact with the souls of the departed, but their job isn't to ferry messages between you and your loved ones. In fact, they may not be doing anything for the living at all. For example, Father Nathan Castle is a Dominican who reports the spirits of people who died in tragic ways coming to him in dreams. He and a prayer partner then seek to have contact with these spirits, so it's planned. It's just not spontaneous communication like an ADC. And they then give these spirits a kind of counseling to help them move on in the afterlife. So they're trying to help the souls of the deceased. They're not trying to do anything to help the living. And Father Castle will not try to contact your departed loved one for you. So he's not functioning as a medium. Instead, he's a mystic who's trying to help the deceased. We discussed Father Castle and his ministry in episodes 269 and 270 at mysterious.fm/269 and mysterious.fm/270. So you can check out those episodes for more information. But as with the death-related experiences, it's obvious that any form of planned communication with departed spirits, whether through a medium or through a mystic, has a direct bearing on whether humans survive bodily death, and so parapsychologists study it.
What about the fourth category that you mentioned as providing evidence here? What about cases of the reincarnation type, or court?
These are experiences that began to be studied in the mid-20th century by American psychologist Dr. Ian Stevenson. We've discussed the present state of research into court in episodes 275 and 276 at mysterious.fm/275 and mysterious.fm/276. These experiences commonly involve small children, many of whom begin reported memories of someone who lived and died before they were born, in fact, before they were even conceived. These cases aren't that common. According to the only study we have, they occur in about 1 in 500 children in a particular part of India, and they're less common elsewhere. But in some cases, it turns out that the information that these children report is veridical. That is, it points to a specific person that the child apparently did not know about in a way that goes beyond random chance. And so, on their face, these cases are at least suggestive of reincarnation, which is why they're called cases of the reincarnation type. Parapsychologists aren't saying they are for sure cases of reincarnation, but they are the type of thing that is at least suggestive of reincarnation, which means that they also suggest survival of bodily death, and so they're part of survival research.
Orthodox Christianity doesn't teach reincarnation, so how would an Orthodox Christian explain cases of the reincarnation type?
There are actually several ways of doing that, and you can listen to episode 276 for more information about those options, but I'll tell you my own preferred theory, which I think explains the data better than many of the alternatives. Basically, I think you can explain court in terms of psychic functioning, where a psychic link is formed between a living person and a previous person, and all the information about that previous person flows through the psychic link. So it's a psychic link that has a single source of information, or a single source psychic link. There's more to say about that, but you can check out episode 276 for the details.
Then let's talk about your fifth and final category of survival-related experiences, which was spontaneous field experiences. What do those involve?
I'll discuss those in a moment, but first I want to note the eighth basic of parapsychology that we need to consider, which is that survival-related experiences include out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, death-related experiences like near-death visions, DBVs, near-death experiences, NDEs, and after-death communications, or ADCs. They also include spirit communications, cases of the reincarnation type, or court, and spontaneous field experiences. Having said that, we can now look at the spontaneous field experiences more closely. Now, there are a bunch of spontaneous experiences that parapsychologists study. Some of them are just spontaneous experiences that seem to involve psychic functioning, like if you're at home and you suddenly have a vision that a chandelier is going to fall onto your baby's crib, So you go and get the baby out of the crib to protect it, and then the chandelier does fall. That experience seems to involve the psychic function of precognition. And it is a real experience someone had, by the way. But it doesn't suggest anything about survival after death. I mean, your baby survived. It wasn't crushed by the fallen chandelier. So there's nothing about survival of death here. But there are spontaneous experiences that people have that are often thought to say something about the survival of bodily death. And 3 of these are what are called hauntings, poltergeists, and apparitions.
Then let's talk about each of these. First, what's a haunting?
In standard colloquial English, this term has a different meaning than it often does in parapsychology. Most people use it to refer to any situation where a person has a ghost regularly appearing somewhere, like in a house. It comes from the old French word hante, which refers to something that is frequent or regular. So if you have a ghost that was frequently or regularly appearing in a place, it would be called a haunting. And the term is sometimes used that way among parapsychologists. They also can talk about ghosts as haunting a location. But the term has come to have a more specialized meaning that's different. One of the things that parapsychologists noted about many reports of hauntings is that the ghosts just kept doing the same thing over and over again, like descending a staircase. I mean, all the ghost did was come down a staircase, and it wouldn't respond to anyone who spoke to it. It would just ignore them. All it would ever do was come down the staircase over and over again like a recording. So the theory arose. Here comes William of Ockham again saying don't postulate entities beyond the evidence. The theory arose that this is what these hauntings were, just recordings. They were like a memory of something that happened in the past in this place. A recording that was left over from something people did when they were alive, perhaps based on some kind of residue that they left at the location. So these are also sometimes called residual hauntings. And a common understanding of hauntings in parapsychology is that they're just recordings or place memories of something that happened in the past.
If that's the case, even though people associate hauntings with the afterlife, do they really imply survival after death?
Actually, no. If they're recordings, then they were left down by people when they were alive, and experiencing a haunting would be just like watching a recording of the 1935 movie Top Hat with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. You may see Fred and Ginger dancing their hearts out, and you may even watch them doing this over and over again if you really like the movie. But it's all material that they laid down in 1935 when they were both still alive. So the fact that you can see them doing this nearly a century later only tells you that you're watching a recording. It doesn't tell you anything about whether Fred or Ginger survived their bodily deaths. In the same way, experiencing this kind of haunting wouldn't say anything about survival. It would tell you that someone did something during their life, but it wouldn't tell you that they survived their death. So if all you see is someone doing the same thing over and over again, and there's no significant variation, and if you can't hold an interactive conversation with them, then you may just be watching a recording. In fact, the person that left the recording may even still be alive, and it doesn't tell you anything about the survival of bodily death. While I haven't yet done a full episode on hauntings, if you'd like a story in which they occur, you can check out episode 210 on the haunted house of Marin County at mysterious.fm/210.
Then let's talk about the next type of spontaneous field experiences, poltergeists. What should we know here?
For hundreds of years, people in cultures around the world have reported experiences in which physical objects start moving with no apparent natural causes. Accompanying this motion are sounds like bangs or thumps, and the experiences often seem random and chaotic. It's been natural to attribute these to the activity of a spirit, which has been the standard interpretation down through history. In the 1500s, the Protestant reformer Martin Luther gave a name to the experiences. He referred to what was causing them as a poltergeist. In German, poltern means noisy or rattling, and geist means ghost, so a poltergeist is a noisy ghost. If it is a ghost causing these experiences, then that would be evidence for survival after bodily death. However, in the 20th century, another explanation for these experiences emerged. Parapsychologists noted that in many cases, though not all of them, The activity seemed to be centered around a single living person, and there was no evidence of a spirit being involved in these cases. The person at the center of the case, in this type of case, thus became known as the poltergeist agent. And by the mid-20th century, it was proposed that many poltergeist cases were due to what is now called recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. Psychokinesis, or PK, is involved because stuff is moving and banging. It happens spontaneously without anyone trying to make it happen, and it keeps happening, so it's recurrent, thus recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. The RSPK theory became prominent after a particular poltergeist case happened in Seaford, New York, which was centered on a young boy named Jimmy Herman. The idea is that RSPK tends to occur when a person is under a great deal of stress, but they feel that they can't express that stress openly. So their subconscious throws a kind of temper tantrum using psychokinesis to vent their frustrations and anxieties. Consequently, stress management techniques are one way of helping poltergeist agents resolve the RSPK that they're experiencing. In poltergeist cases where RSPK is the explanation, well, they wouldn't have any bearing on the survival on survival after death, because the person producing the effects is a living person. We discussed poltergeists, including the RSPK theory, back in episode 195 on poltergeists in general. We also talked about the Seaford poltergeist in episode 295, and we discussed the case of a little boy who was influencing electronic devices in episodes 260. So we have several RSPK-related cases for you to hear about. However, if living humans have psychokinesis as one of their mind's abilities, then departed humans would also have the same ability, and it's thus believed that there are cases in which departed human spirits are responsible for poltergeist phenomena. In these cases, there is evidence for a spirit that's involved. The case tends not to be centered around a single living person, and the poltergeist activity seems to be more organized and less chaotic. So these cases would be ones providing evidence about the survival of bodily death. However, they can also be classified in a different way, and here in America, they would tend to be classified as apparitions that just happen to have poltergeist-like features.
Then let's talk about the third of the spontaneous field experiences you mentioned, apparitions. What should we know about them?
An apparition occurs when a spirit appears. That's where the term comes from. And the same term is used both in religious circles, where apparitions of the saints are often reported, and in parapsychological circles, where the term is applied to any spirit that appears, whether it's the spirit of a saint or someone else. Spirits are reported to appear in a variety of ways. They may appear to one or all of the senses, just like in after-death communications, or people may just feel or know that the spirit is present. There are a few factors that make apparitions different than after-death communications, although you could also think of them as a subset of apparitions. One is that you tend to personally know the individual who appears in an after-death communication, but you tend to not personally know the person that's appearing in an apparition. They could be a complete stranger. Also, ADCs usually happen shortly after a loved one has died, but apparitions don't. They can occur long after the person has died. And instead of being based around a person that the apparition knew during life, they're often based around a place that was important to the person. For example, in an ADC, it may be person-based. Your loved one appears to you, but in an apparition, they may not appear to you in particular. They may be appearing in a house that they used to live in, and it's the house, not you, that's what's important to them. So apparitions include typical ghost encounters that we often hear about. We discussed one such ghostly encounter in episode 115 at mysterious.fm/115 on the Wizard Clip. We also discussed another in episode 164 at mysterious.fm/164 on the Border Patrol Ghost, and another in episode 174 at mysterious.fm/174 on the Greenbrier Ghost. Obviously, if the spirit of a person is appearing to the living and this is really happening, then That bears directly on the survival of bodily death. However, if the deceased have the ability to appear to the living, then the living should have that same ability. And it turns out that there are what are known as apparitions of the living, where one living person appears to another living person. Sometimes these occur in what are known as crisis apparitions, like when a person you know might appear to you if they're currently in a crisis, like maybe they've been physically injured and are calling out for help. The living also appear to the living in cases of what are known as bilocation, which is when one person appears to be in two places at once. We talked about bilocation back in episode 212 at mysterious.fm/212, and you can also check out The Haunted House of Marin County in episode 210. These apparitions of the living would obviously not tell us anything about the survival of bodily death, but if the spirit of a deceased person appears, it would. However, all of this is detail, and the fundamental basic of parapsychology that I ask my students to remember is spontaneous field experiences include hauntings, poltergeists, and apparitions.
There's a bit of a shift in the kind of activities involved in this last basic compared to some of the former ones. What do you think listeners should understand here?
Well, many of the basics that we've covered deal with things that can be researched in a laboratory. For example, you can bring people into a lab and give them ESP and PK tests. You can thus test these things under controlled conditions where you can prevent alternative explanations for being responsible for the results that you get in the experiments, like not having a participant even touch the thing that they're supposed to use PK on. That would prevent one avenue that the test participant might intentionally or unintentionally affect the objects, though there are other avenues that still would need to be prevented or controlled for. However, when you start getting into survival phenomena, this starts to change. Many survival phenomena can't be studied in the lab for the simple reason that you can't ethically kill people as part of your experiments. So you can't ethically induce a near-death experience. Those need to occur in the field, outside of highly controlled conditions, though there are things you can do to study them in a scientific manner. The situation gets even more difficult with spontaneous field experiences. It's hard to bring a haunting, a non-living poltergeist, or an apparition into a lab to study it. However, these experiences still take place, and when they do, people are concerned about them. If a poltergeist is tearing up your living room, that's something to be concerned about. And so, like many other forms of science, we have a division between pure research and applied science. Like in medicine, psychology, and economics, you may do laboratory experiments, but in addition to doing the pure research in the lab, you also want it to lead to practical applications to actually help people, like giving them drugs to treat an illness, or helping them with mental problems, or forecasting what the stock market's going to do and where to invest or to sell. In the same way, people need help understanding and dealing with spontaneous field experiences, including hauntings, poltergeists, and apparitions. And so it's important to be aware that, like in many other fields, parapsychology isn't just about pure research. It's also an applied science that seeks to help people with the paranormal things they encounter.
If people are interested in learning more about parapsychology, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm always happy to have people take the Introduction to Parapsychology course. It's an 8-week course that I typically teach twice a year. There's one class a week, and in it, I go over the field of parapsychology in much more detail than we've done today. I use the 9 basics I presented in this episode as a kind of organizing principle for the course, but I go into a lot more detail by, for example, sharing the results of scientific experiments that have been done with different forms of ESP and PK and survival situations. All of the courses are taught online, and so you don't have to attend the lectures live because they're all recorded, so they'll fit into your schedule. You also can take the course either for a grade or just audit it, and if you take it for a grade and pass, which is not difficult, you get a special certificate signed by me once the course is done. The place to go to learn more about Introduction to Parapsychology The other courses that I teach and other courses offered by the Rhine Education Center is rhineedu.org. That's RHINE-EDU.org. And we'll also have a link to that in the further resources, as well as a number of books that you can also check out. Personally, I think that parapsychology is a very interesting field. It has a lot of overlap with religious topics, which are even more important. So I think it's well worth studying, and I hope you can join me and have an even better background for considering many of the topics that we cover here on Mysterious World.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line?
Parapsychology is a very interesting field. To name just the 9 basics I've covered, parapsychology is a branch of science that studies psychic phenomena and the survival of bodily death. Psychic abilities are generally treated as natural human abilities, that is, abilities of the human mind. Psychic abilities are divided into extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. Therefore, the principal areas of study in parapsychology are ESP, PK, and survival. The principal forms of extrasensory perception are telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Psychokinesis may affect both living and non-living things. Psychokinesis can manifest on the large scale, which is macro PK, the small scale, which is micro PK, or somewhere in between. Survival-related experiences include out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, death-related experiences like deathbed visions, or DBVs, near-death experiences, or NDEs, and after-death communications, or ADCs. They also include deliberate spirit communication, cases of the reincarnation type, or court, and spontaneous field experiences. And spontaneous field experiences include hauntings, poltergeists, and apparitions.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the viewers and listeners?
We'll have links to the Rhine Education Center at rhineedu.org. Also, Irwin and Watt's book, An Introduction to Parapsychology, 5th edition, which I use as a textbook in Intro to Parapsychology. Also, Cardania et al.'s book, Parapsychology, a Handbook for the 21st Century, which is massive and very informative. Alois Feisinger's book, Occult Phenomena in Light of Theology, and Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life.
And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the field of parapsychology? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Check out the podcast in video form at my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And right now, at time of recording, I'm trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers, and you can help me do that by liking, commenting, writing a review, and sharing the video with others. Also, be sure and subscribe. That's the best way of all to help me reach 100,000 subscribers. And when you do, be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
Very good. And so, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, I'm not sure what we're going to be doing. We're recording this far enough in advance that I'm still working on scripts, and so what we'll be doing next week remains, both for you and for me, a mystery.
Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. That helps us grow our community and reach more listeners. You can get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/360. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Vergeson Electric and Automation, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida at aaronv.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.